Our next speaker is someone of whom it would be more than usually appropriate to say that he needs no introduction. He's a distinguished scholar in both Nietzsche studies and in continental philosophy in general, and also in legal philosophy. And he has the high praise of having a recent book called Why Tolerate Religion, described as one of the most troubling and intellectually discreditable books by a serious American scholar in some time. And that is praise because it comes from the Family Research Council. Google them. So Brian Leiter is going to talk to us today about William's debt to Nietzsche, real or illusory, ? Over to Brian.
Thank you very much. I wanted Princeton University Press to put that blurb on the paperback edition, but they wouldn't go for it. All right. Well, thanks very much to Paul Russell for organizing this and for including me. I've already learned quite a lot about Williams just in our first two sessions. So, Bernard Williams was one of just two distinguished figures within the mainstream of Anglophone moral philosophy in the second half of the 20th century to devote serious attention to Nietzsche. Philippa Foot was the other comparably famous figure to do so, and she unsurprisingly shared with Williams skepticism about many orthodoxies of analytic moral philosophy during this time, though I think she shared a slightly different set of skepticism about the orthodoxies. Now, Derek Parfit, slightly younger but probably more influential on the shape of the Anglophone profession more recently, also ended up professing to take Nietzsche seriously, or at least giving him a lot of attention in his final work on What Matters. Unlike Williams and Foote, however, it was rather too obvious that Nietzsche was Parfit's enemy, to be defanged, defamed, and disposed of. Williams, by contrast, was clearly a friendly and appreciative reader of Nietzsche, even referencing him explicitly on many occasions in what seemed to me his two most important monographs, Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy from 1985 and Shame and Necessity from 1993. I'm happy to talk in Q&A a little about truth and truthfulness, though despite its being called the genealogy, it seems to me it's very un-Nietzschean in two very important respects. First of all, he admits it's a just-so story, whereas Nietzsche was emphatic that the genealogy had to have a factual and evidential basis. For Nietzsche, that was largely etymological. And secondly, of course, it's meant to be vindicatory of the concept, whereas Nietzsche was explicit that genealogy, for him, was a critical tool to undermine, in Nietzsche's case, morality. Okay. So I'm not going to talk about that book. So my aim here is to assess the Williams-Nietzsche relationship and the extent to which Williams learned from Nietzsche and the extent to which he retreated from or ignored Nietzsche's actual views. Williams' reaction to Nietzsche will also tell us something about the distinctive and, I think, conservative nature of Anglophone philosophy over the last century. And this deserves some further comment at the start. Of the various fault lines between Anglophone philosophy of the last century in the analytic tradition and the multiple and often conflicting traditions in post-Kantian continental philosophy, two are especially important in connection with the relation between Williams and Nietzsche. First, in Germany, beginning arguably with Herder in the 18th century, there was a strong historicist turn in philosophy. Historicism, for our purposes, consists of two theses, one stronger than the other. The first, weaker historicist thesis is that the reference of concepts or terms usually varies by historical context, so much so that the same concept or term can pick out radically different reference at different historical moments, and thus it's a mistake to assimilate them or assume the concepts have the same meaning across historical epochs. The second, stronger historicist thesis holds that these concepts have no correct referent that transcends the historical period. The concept good may, as Nietzsche argues, pick out, quote, elevated, proud states of the soul and, quote, nobility in antiquity, and then in the Christian world instead picks out, quote, the warm heart, patient industriousness, humility, and friendliness, until, as Nietzsche says, the words good and stupid come close together. Neither is the correct meaning of good, although the claim is stronger than one about semantics. It is that good qua metaphysical fact does not exist, but is created and projected onto the world by people with very different interests and attitudes. Even Hegel, perhaps the most famous, albeit atypical historicist, can mostly agree with this characterization of historicism, with the important caveat that he thinks historical fluidity comes to an end in which the semantics and the metaphysics coincide on God's intention for his creation as interpreted by Hegel. But Hegel is an outlier in the historicist tradition, unlike Nietzsche. And Williams, as I will argue, is in important senses an anti-historicist thinker. Very much unlike Nietzsche, but very much like most analytic philosophers who write as though they are illuminating the right, the good, the just, or in Williams's case, the ethical life. But there's a second view distinctive of most, but not all, of the post-Kantian traditions in European philosophy. Husserl is an exception to this. Habermas, who is an exception to this, and I'm happy to talk about that if people are interested. So there's this second view distinctive of most of the post-Kantian traditions that should be unsurprising in light of the historicism. These post-Kantian philosophers eschew appeals to, quote, common sense or our moral thinking or intuitions, since these are simply historically contingent data points, suitable for diagnosis, for example, as artifacts of capitalism or the slave revolt in morals or the modern era of biopower, and perhaps all of these or more, but they're not suitable for understanding the real world. These post-Kantian philosophers all embrace the idea that on the one hand, philosophers should aim to diagnose and assess what is really happening in culture and society, politically and psychologically and sociologically, and on the other hand, to help human beings, or some human beings, achieve a kind of liberation, often an incoherently theorized notion of liberation. Marx, Nietzsche, Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and Foucault are all what we might call emancipatory realists in this broad sense, even though the Marxian idea of emancipation of the individual is rather different than Nietzsche's, needless to say. Roughly, we could say that Marx thinks individuals are liberated when they can engage in free productive activity unrelated to securing the means of survival, while Nietzsche is only concerned with liberating certain higher human beings from their false consciousness about the dominant morality, which in fact is incompatible with their flourishing. So what these continental emancipatory realists all share is a rejection of the conservative conception of philosophy well articulated by Judith Jarvis Thomson of MIT. Here's what Thomson says. The main central problems of philosophy consist in efforts to explain what makes certain pre-philosophical or non-philosophical beliefs true, namely those that we rely on in ordinary life. She associated this conservative approach to philosophy quite rightly, I think, with G. Moore and Wittgenstein, but it is utterly foreign to those who begin with the assumption that ordinary life is shot through with falsehood, illusion, and historically contingent commitments. Williams, I think it turns out, is closer to Thomson than he is to Nietzsche on this score. So I'll begin my discussion with ethics and the limits of philosophy and then turn to shame and necessity, although I'll note certain continuities of concern between the two. So in an article in Ethics more than 20 years ago, I proposed the distinction between two kinds of criticisms of morality then common in Anglophone moral philosophy, and revisiting that distinction will be useful here. So theory critics, as I named them, and this includes Williams, but also Annette Beyer and Charles Taylor, among many others, are those who denied that our particular moral assessments and common sense moral principles are apt subjects for a theory, in a precise and technical sense of the word theory. And theories in this sense have two characteristics. First, they try to reduce all value to a single unitary source. I'll just refer to this as reduction. And second, they try to articulate an explicit mechanical decision procedure for generating answers to ethical questions, or explicit criteria for ethical decision and a decision procedure for their application. And I'll call that obviously mechanical decision. Now, the two attributes are closely related. It is precisely theory's reduction of value to a single source that makes possible theory's goal of a mechanical decision procedure, namely one that uses the privileged basic value to churn out, we might say, moral directives. Against these aims, the theory critics argue that value is not unitary. There are, in Taylor's phrase, a diversity of good. and that partly as a result, mechanical decision procedures are simply impossible in the ethical life. Ethical decision and action, these critics say, requires practical wisdom, virtues, or sensitivity to the particular context, all things which allegedly cannot be captured within the confines of theory. A common refrain among theory critics, including Bernard Williams, is that the rejection of theory in this technical sense does not entail the rejection of ethical reflection. Of course, if it would seem that if something is to count as reflecting at all, as opposed simply, say, to emoting, then it must aim for some degree of abstraction, simplification, generality, and coherence. Theory in the objectionable sense must require something else, otherwise all reflection would involve theory. And my proposal is that this something else is captured by the joint aims of reduction and mechanical decision. It is these that mark the line between bad theory and good or acceptable ethical reflection. Now, this aspect of Williams' views in Ethics in the Limits of Philosophy and elsewhere obviously has nothing to do with Nietzsche, and I do not read Williams as claiming otherwise. Nietzsche thought practical reflection was an epiphenomenal illusion, and that philosophers invoke, quote, practical reason precisely when, as Nietzsche puts it, reason has nothing to do with it. I've defended this view at length in my recent book, Moral Psychology with Nietzsche, and I'm going to return to this issue below in the context of some themes from Williams' Shame and Necessity. Now, by contrast to those I called the theory critics, I dubbed another group the morality critics. And here I'm thinking of Michael Stocker, Susan Wolf, and again Bernard Williams, among others. The morality critics criticize moral theory not because of its theoretical ambitions, but because of either the substantive content of the morality endorsed or the weight assigned in practical reasoning to moral demands. Admittedly, the morality critics often present themselves as critics of morality itself. In that sense, they echo Nietzsche rhetorically. But on examination, I think it becomes clear their targets are specific philosophical theories of morality, consequentialist and deontological. The Williams of Ethics in the Limits of Philosophy is illustrative in this regard. Williams calls morality, quote, the peculiar institution, and says this morality, quote, is not an invention of philosophers, but rather the outlook, or incoherently, I think, not incoherently, part of the outlook of almost all of us. He goes on to worry about, quote, the several natural ways in which this morality's special notion of obligation, quote, can come to dominate a life altogether. In passages like these, Williams seems to be objecting not that the best moral theory requires obligation to dominate life, but rather that once moral obligation is allowed to, quote, structure ethical thought, it has a, quote, natural tendency to rule out all other considerations. The appearances here are, I think, deceiving. While Williams wants to align himself with Nietzsche as a critic of morality as a genuine cultural phenomenon, hence the rhetoric about the peculiar institution, which is an allusion to slavery, which was an actual institution, and morality not being, quote, an invention of philosophers, it is far from clear that the notion of moral obligation he discusses is anything other than a philosopher's invention, or at best such a severe systematic reworking of the ordinary notion as to be only a distant relative of the much more tepid notion of obligation actually at work in our culture. And as some philosophers, notably Steve Darwell, have argued, Bernard Williams may have gotten the philosopher's notion wrong as well, and I gather Steve will return to that theme in his talk. The domain of the demanding notion of obligation, as Williams conceives it, appears to be strictly found among those committed to orthodox religions. Hardly anybody else in the neoliberal world order of the capitalist countries, after all, thinks anything must be done regardless of the cost, except, as far as I can tell, some Kantians and religious fundamentalists. And there may be a reason for that overlap. Indeed, morality's purportedly threatening notion of obligation is in fact constructed by Williams entirely from the works of Kant and W.D. Ross, with no gesture at showing what relation their philosophically refined notions bear to those in play in ordinary life. Yet where is the evidence, one might ask, that real people treat, quote, moral obligations as inescapable, and that they accept the idea that, quote, only an obligation can beat an obligation, as Williams puts it? Surely the evidence is not in the way people actually live, in the way they actually honor or more often breach their moral obligations, a point Nietzsche well understood. What is the evidence that in our relativistic and neoliberal culture, individuals think that, quote, moral obligation applies to people even if they do not want it to? Even Williams, in leading up to the specter of morality dominating life, says that, quote, the thought can gain a footing. I am not saying that it has to, that I could be better employed than in doing something I am under no moral obligation to do, and if I could be, then I ought to be. But surely this, quote, thought might only gain a footing for Kant or Ross or some severe consequentialist philosopher like Shelley Kagan. It is, I think, a pure philosopher's fantasy to think that real people in the moral culture at large find themselves overwhelmed by this burdensome sense of moral obligation. Like the other morality critics, Williams writes as though he is attacking morality, when what he is really attacking is morality as conceived, systematized, and refined by philosophers. Such a critique may be an intellectually valuable endeavor, but it is quite different than Nietzsche's worry that the various forms of morality we have inherited from the Judeo-Christian tradition are, quote, as Nietzsche puts it, detrimental to the higher men, that they, and again quote Nietzsche, would be to blame if the highest power and splendor possible to the type man was never in fact attained in real life. Right? And this is a point to which I'll return momentarily. Well, can we salvage the supposed alliance between morality critics like Williams and Nietzsche? Well, consider Thomas Nagel's useful way of framing the issue, and this is from The View from Nowhere. According to Nagel, there is a potential conflict between the good life, one which is valuable along non-moral dimensions, and the moral life, one in which moral considerations govern, or between, as Nagel puts it, living well and doing right. So for philosophers like Williams, think of his discussion of Gauguin, and Susan Wolf, think of her discussion of moral saints, the good life and the moral life can conflict, and for those, unlike Williams and Wolf, who think moral considerations are always overriding, that is so much the worse for the good life. Nagel is clear about where he locates Nietzsche in the debate thus framed, and here I quote Nagel, "The good life overrides the moral life." This is Nietzsche's position. The view is that if taking everything into consideration, a moral life will not be a good life for the individual, it would be a mistake to lead it. Thus, like the morality critics, Nietzsche is supposed to side with the importance of the good life against the encroaching demands of the moral life. Even granting that Nietzsche is perhaps more extreme in his rejection of the demands of the moral life, he still counts as the first in a line of morality critics that includes Williams, Wolf, and others who recognize the conflict between the good life and the morality life, but at the same time reject the idea that moral considerations are overriding. But even this reframing significantly understates the remaining differences. Here's how Richard Miller, I think, aptly put it. Nietzsche often seems to recommend that the constraints of morality be ignored, but it would be a misreading of his intentions to infer that morality ought to be ignored by someone of middling abilities, or a primary interest in family life, or by someone whose characteristic striving is a successful leverage buyout. This is the 1980s. In contrast, this is still Miller, the troubling recommendations at the center of current disputes are very broadly addressed. In particular, Bernard Williams' influential warnings about morality are addressed primarily to people with normal attachments and their own projects which may be of ordinary sorts. That's Miller. Well, consider. The academic morality critics speak of the moral life conflicting with, and here are some examples, Michael Stocker, love, friendship, affection, fellow feeling, and community. Susan Wolf, with a healthy, well-rounded, richly developed life, which might include reading Victorian novels, playing the oboe, or improving one's backhand. And now here's Williams, from Person's Character and Morality. It might conflict with the importance of individual character and personal relations. They worry, in short, about the incompatibility between morality and the kind of pleasant bourgeois life these philosophers enjoy. I enjoy it too. And these worries strike a somewhat different note from Nietzsche, who speaks of morality posing a threat, for example, to, quote, the highest power and splendor actually possible to the type man, to, quote, the self-reliant, independent, unprejudiced men, the pillars of a strong civilization, to, quote, all that is rare, strange privilege, the higher soul, the higher duty, the higher responsibility, and the abundance of creative power and masterfulness, to, quote, the men of great creativity, the really great men, according to my understanding. So here the worry is not merely that the moral life will interfere with various mundane personal goods important to the average bourgeois, but rather that it is incompatible with the highest forms of human excellence. The moral life for Nietzsche is not a threat to the good life, but we might say to the extraordinary life. Nietzsche, it bears emphasizing, was fundamentally worried about whether our culture was making it impossible as a matter of empirical fact for anyone to live an extraordinary life anymore. It is one of the few themes that animated his writings from start to finish. In an early essay of the mid-1870s called Schopenhauer as Educator, Nietzsche speaks of, quote, the goal of culture as, quote, the production of genius. Though there he worries not primarily about the deleterious effects of morality on culture, but about what he calls the crudest and most evil forces, the egoism of the moneymakers and the military despots. As well, he adds, the greed of the state. His major work of the early 1880s, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, begins with Zarathustra's image of a world in which human excellence and creativity is gone, in which all that will remain is the last man. And here's Zarathustra. Alas, the time of the most despicable man is coming, he that is no longer able to despise himself. Behold, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Thus asked the last man, and he blinks. The earth has become small, and on it hops the last man who makes everything small. Quote, we have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink. They have left the regions where it was hard to live, for one needs warmth. One still loves one's neighbor and rubs against him, for one needs warmth. No shepherd in one herd, everybody wants the same, everybody is the same. Whoever feels differently goes voluntarily into a madhouse. Formerly all the world was mad, say the most refined, and they blink. One is clever and knows everything that has ever happened, so there is no end of derision. One still quarrels, but one is soon reconciled, else it might spoil the digestion. In his last productive year of 1888, Nietzsche speaks of Christian morality as having, quote, waged war unto death against the presupposition of every elevation, of every growth of culture, and he claims that acting in accord with what has been called morality, quote, would deprive existence of its great character. The distinctively Nietzschean worry, then, is that our moral culture, not our best moral theory, is ushering in the reign of the last man, of complete mediocrity and banality. This approach to critique places Nietzsche not in the company of Anglo-American morality critics, but rather in that European tradition of modern discontent with bourgeois Christian culture that runs, we might say, from Baudelaire to Freud, with echoes audible in the critical theories of Adorno and Marcuse. Now, Nietzsche's explanation of how modern moral culture threatens the highest power and splendor possible to the type man depends on a speculative psychology about how a culture suffused with morality will affect the flourishing of higher human beings. Here I'll give just one example, but this is a more complex topic that I won't have time to explore. So take Nietzsche's objection to the utilitarian emphasis on eliminating suffering and promoting happiness. Here's what Nietzsche says. Are we not, with this tremendous objective of obliterating all the sharp edges of life, well on the way to turning mankind into sand? Sand, small, soft, round, unending sand. Is that your ideal, you heralds of the sympathetic affections? And in a later work, Nietzsche says, referring to hedonists and utilitarians, that, quote, well-being as you understand it, that is no goal. That seems to us an end, a state that soon makes man ridiculous and contemptible. Now, by the hedonistic doctrine of well-being, Nietzsche takes the utilitarians to have in mind, quote, English happiness, namely comfort and fashion. A construal which, if unfair to some utilitarians, may do justice to our ordinary aspirations. In a similar vein, Nietzsche has Zarathustra dismiss, quote, wretched contentment as an ideal, while also revealing that it was precisely those last men, those most despicable men, who invented happiness in the first place. His underlying idea seems to be this. Suffering is a spur to creativity, at least in higher human beings, and here he generalizes from his own experience, which was a life of considerable physical suffering that he nonetheless took to be an essential precondition for everything he did. So suffering is a spur to creativity, at least in higher human beings, and a culture that treats suffering as an evil and happiness as the most important men will divert potential higher human beings from their potential as they pursue pleasure and the cessation of suffering. An allegedly too demanding notion of obligation plays no role here for Nietzsche. His attack, unlike Williams's, is vulnerable to the empirical evidence about how a culture suffused with morality really affects individual geniuses, but the entire debate between the Anglophone moral philosophers in which Williams is such an important figure is, I think, irrelevant to Nietzsche's concerns. This same kind of mismatch in concerns plays a role in Nietzsche's and Williams's different approaches to the Greeks, to which I'm now turn. So in Shame and Necessity, Williams explicitly defends one anti-historicist thesis, namely that the folk psychology of action and motivation in the Homeric world, as well as certain allied notions that are part of our ethical outlook, as he calls it, such as responsibility and shame, are not really different in kind from ours. His particular target is scholars like Bruno Snell, who took the Homeric Greeks to be morally inferior on most of these counts. Nietzsche would certainly disagree with Snell, but it is less clear how much he would agree with Williams. There are points on which Williams is convincing, probably even by Nietzschean lights, but there are respects in which Williams systematically downplays the radical differences between us and the Greeks that were so important to Nietzsche. Williams himself is no doubt aware of this tension. He describes Nietzsche in Shame and Necessity as a thinker, quote, with whom my inquiry has relations that are very close and necessarily ambiguous. But when Williams also claims that, quote, if we can come to understand the ethical concepts of the Greeks, we shall recognize them in ourselves. What we recognize is an identity in content. I take him to be affirming something that Nietzsche often denies. As Nietzsche puts it in an early essay titled Homer's Contest, quote, this is Nietzsche now, what a gulf of ethical judgment lies between us and him, that is Homer. And I think that's Nietzsche's view throughout. But for Nietzsche, this observation has very little to do with Snell's moralizing condescension. Nietzsche takes the normative content of ethical thought in the Homeric world to be dramatically different from ours and largely superior. Because this assessment is so unfamiliar, even in Williams's treatment, it requires a bit of further exposition at the start. Now, Nietzsche's understanding of the Greeks was shaped profoundly by that of his University of Basel colleague, Jakob Burckhardt, who was probably the most important historian of both the Italian Renaissance and classical Greece that the 19th century produced. Burckhardt's vision of both historical epochs was distinctive. The cultural excellence of the 5th century BC in Greece and then the Italian Renaissance was due to the extraordinary competitiveness of the different city-states, not just politically, but in the intellectual and artistic realms. And this is what Nietzsche calls the agonistic spirit of the Greeks, and he takes it the Italians during the Renaissance period. Now, in our neoliberal era, it bears emphasizing that the agonistic spirit of the Greeks and Renaissance Italians was not about success in the capitalist marketplace, which was irrelevant, but about excellence in the domain of cultural achievement as adjudged by elites. Nietzsche, in his very first book, The Birth of Tragedy, from 1872, had already emphasized the central place of Greek tragedy in the competitive Dionysian cult festivals that were the central public event of the year in the life of the Greek polis. Right? And this is where Sophocles and Aeschylus presented their plays. It was a competition to see who could produce the best tragedies. And in the case of the Greeks, it gave us Sophocles and Aeschylus, just as that of the Italian Renaissance produced its own geniuses, Da Vinci and Michelangelo being only the two best known. And both Burckhardt and Nietzsche took this culturally fertile competitive environment to be inseparable from its political competition. Competition in pursuit of excellence and domination was essential to both epochs. This productively competitive ethos reflects the radically different values of the Homeric world and much of subsequent classical Greece and Rome until the Socratic, Platonic, and Stoic reactions with which we are all now familiar. Perhaps so familiar that we don't realize they were reactions, as Nietzsche would like to point out. Homeric ethics valorized honor, power, wealth, the ability to exact revenge, martial prowess, bodily pleasures, facility with lying and deception. And these were all values that Christianity inverted, as Nietzsche himself famously argued in the first essay On the Genealogy of Morality. Christianity values honesty, humility, chastity, and turning the other cheek. It condemns wealth, revenge, and sexual pleasure. Now, we comfortable bourgeois academics of the current era understandably find such claims difficult to assess. The correlation between intense and localized political and military conflict and cultural achievement in both ancient Greece and the Italian Renaissance are striking, and they certainly impress Burckhardt and his junior colleague Nietzsche. At the present historical moment, of course, when the monster child Donald Trump rules the United States, it bears emphasizing that just as Nietzsche and Burckhardt hated Otto Bismarck, and they did, they would have no doubt been gripped by paroxysms of contempt and bafflement by Trump. Trump undoubtedly valorizes, in some sense, most of the things that Homer does, but he is unable to achieve any of them. He is, for example, a transparent liar who fools no one, and whom no one believes other than the rabble, as Nietzsche would say, and his lies serve no purpose other than satisfying his vanity, what Nietzsche would call the selfishness of the sick, or as Nietzsche's Zarathustra puts it. Contrast Odysseus, right, who lies his way out of the grips of the Cyclops and lies his way into his former home in order to surprise and slaughter the suitors of his wife Penelope and thus exact his just revenge. Right? And he's clearly celebrated for his ability to do this in Homer. Trump has no martial prowess and no honor, and he cannot even wield political power effectively due to his narcissism and stupidity. Even in the domain of bodily pleasure, Trump is reduced to a kind of prostitution, both short and long term. Trump aspires to this, I always have trouble saying this word, the simulacra, thank you, of the Homeric values that the actual Homeric heroes realize. The relevant contrast for understanding Nietzsche, right, so Trump is not whom he's thinking of, is with Napoleon, who was one of those in the standard 19th century pantheon of geniuses. This view was not peculiar to Nietzsche at all, and along with Goethe and Beethoven, who were two of Nietzsche's other favorites examples. Napoleon himself cultivated the myth of his own genius, but it is also true that Napoleon really did have martial prowess, that he was honored and renowned, that he wielded extraordinarily effective power, right? So much so that to this day, France and its elaborate administrative bureaucracy bears the complete mark of Napoleon's influence because Napoleon was such a details guy in the way he set everything up. And Napoleon was in so many respects, in these respects and others, a kind of Homeric hero, complete with his disregard for human life. All right, so much for Nietzsche's reasons for disagreeing with Snell's moralizing condescension toward the agonistic ethos of the Greeks. Bernard Williams' disagreements with Snell are more modest. Williams finds the, quote, ethical outlook of the Greeks more appealing because they lack, quote, the accretions of misleading philosophy, such as Kantian ideals of freedom, responsibility, and obligation, a dualistic distinction between soul and body, and the idea of the will, to take a few of the main examples he's concerned with in Shame and Necessity. In each case, it is clear that Williams thinks much of our current ethical outlook can be reconstructed quite adequately without these accretions of misleading philosophy, an ambition obviously foreign to Nietzsche, even if Nietzsche shares Williams' allergy to Kant, and it is indeed an allergy. As Williams puts it, the differences between us and the Greeks, quote, cannot best be understood in terms of a shift in basic ethical conceptions of agency, responsibility, shame, or freedom. Rather, by better grasping these conceptions themselves and the extent to which we share them with antiquity, we may be helped to recognize some illusions about the modern world. That's Williams. Now, I think this stands Nietzsche's project on its head, even if on its own terms Williams is sometimes right. The Greeks have, for example, enough of the conceptual framework for talk of voluntary action, right? But at the same time, this completely ignores the radically different content of matters of normative concern for the Greeks. And even with respect to the philosophical psychology, as it were, there are instances where Nietzsche would surely dissent. Williams acknowledges that the Greeks lack the idea of the will, and that they have no word for intention. Yet Williams claims that none of this separates the Greeks fundamentally from us. Homer, says Williams, recognizes, quote, the capacities to deliberate, to conclude, to act, to exert oneself, to make oneself do things, to endure. And the mere addition of a will is simply an invention of bad philosophy, according to Williams. And so too with intentional action. This is Williams again. People's deliberations, their thoughts about what to do, issued in their actions. These truths are obvious. Nietzsche denies them all. I'll come back to that in a moment. Although William goes on to claim that there is a problem of free will only for those who think that the notion of the voluntary can be metaphysically deepened, he ends up, I think, endorsing a familiar philosophical response to the problem of free will, namely compatibilism. Human beings are not free. This is, now I'm quoting William, human beings are not free in the further sense demanded by some metaphysics of being free from the laws of nature. This freedom they do not need. Human beings are metaphysically free in the negative sense that there is nothing in the structure of the universe that denies their power to intend, to decide, to act, indeed to take and receive responsibility in the fundamental and intelligible sense that we found in an earlier chapter already in Homer. Now, Nietzsche repudiates this entire philosophical psychology, although it is less clear whether he would deny Williams's claim that it is to be found in the early Greeks. I think he probably would, but I'm not enough of a scholar of the Greeks to opine on this at all knowledgeably. But the useful contrast is with Arthur Atkins' book on Greek ethics, with which Williams takes much issue, but arguably Atkins has the better of it on certain points. Okay, so this is a large topic about, that is, the philosophical psychology that Nietzsche rejects and why he rejects it. And again, this is what I've treated at some length in my recent book, so I'm just going to say a few brief words here. According to Nietzsche, consciousness is a surface. That's how he puts it. And it is a surface that conceals what is actually causally efficacious in our action, namely our unconscious mental states, in particular our drives being dispositions to have certain kinds of affective responses, for example, sexual arousal in the presence of an arousing sexual object. When we talk of the will or of the motive that precedes an action, we are referring, according to Nietzsche, to errors and phantoms, merely a surface phenomenon of consciousness, something alongside the deed that is more likely to cover up the antecedents of the deed than to represent them. Only our, quote, ridiculous overestimation and misunderstanding of consciousness, again a quote from Nietzsche, leads us to fail to recognize that, quote, the greatest part of our spirit's activity remains unconscious and unfelt, that, quote, everything of which we become conscious causes nothing. Now, I allied many details here regarding different kinds of conscious mental states, but the crucial claim for Nietzsche is that conscious deliberation is an epiphenomenon, and that talk of our reasons for acting is just a post hoc, just so story that we concoct. Thus, Nietzsche rejects, I take it, compatibilist as well as incompatibilist views of free will and responsibility. Our will does not stand outside the causal order, but what we take to be our reasons for acting are also causally unconnected to what we do. What Williams deems these obvious truths about action, that we deliberate and the deliberation issues in the action, Nietzsche, in fact, deems to be falsehoods. Unsurprisingly, given these preceding remarks of Nietzsche's, he also rejects the idea that we are ever responsible for what we do. In an early work, he writes, and I quote, "Do I have to add that the wise Oedipus was right, that we really are not responsible for our dreams, but just as little for our waking life, and that the doctrine of freedom of will has human pride and feeling of power for its father and mother." So we may have other motives for wanting to think ourselves free, but we are as little responsible for what we do in real life as what we do in our dreams. He sounds the very same themes in one of his last works, and I quote again, "Formerly man was given a free will as his dowry from a higher order. Today we have taken his will away altogether in the sense that we no longer admit the will as a faculty. The old word will now serves only to denote a resultant, a kind of individual reaction, which follows necessarily upon a number of partly contradictory, partly harmonious stimuli. The will no longer acts or moves." Since the faculty of will no longer acts or moves, that is, it's no longer causal, then there remains no conceptual space for the compatibilist idea that the right kind of causal determination of the will is compatible with responsibility for our actions. If, as Zarathustra puts it, thought is one thing, the deed is another, and the image of the deed still another, the wheel of causality does not roll between them. Right? They are causally unrelated to each other. Then there's going to be no room for moral responsibility. I may well identify with my thoughts or my will, but they do not cause my actions. And so how could I be responsible for them? Unlike Williams, compatibilism about free will, I take it, is not an option for Nietzsche. Now, Williams acknowledges throughout Shame and Necessity that there are, quote, differences we must approve between ourselves and the Greeks because there has been, quote, progress, meaning, I take it, moral progress. Williams points particularly to our ideas about women and slaves, but says this is not a matter of, quote, some new structural conception called morality. Here the word structural is doing a lot of work, for it seems to me it was surely a radically new conception of morality that viewed all human beings as moral equals in virtue of being human, a view with which Nietzsche, the most radical inegalitarian of modernity, had no sympathy. Williams's efforts to dismiss this difference as not being structural is indicative, I think, of how deep the anti-historicist impulse runs in Shame and Necessity, but perhaps also how little Williams veers from Thompson's conception of philosophy as vindicating, quote, what makes certain pre-philosophical or non-philosophical beliefs true, namely those that we rely on in ordinary life. And I think we actually saw a nice example of that in Miranda Fricker's illuminating discussion of Williams' attempt to vindicate practices of blame, whereas I think Nietzsche is very happy to say that they are predicated on errors and aren't in fact justified at all. Okay. My conclusion, then, is that Bernard Williams' debt to Nietzsche is superficial, although not illusory. Yet it marks such a dramatic departure from the creditor's main ideas and claims as to make the suggested affinity more misleading than illuminating. Now, this need not strike one as an objection to Williams, of course. As a political theorist reviewing Williams' Shame and Necessity at the time of its publication put the point rather nicely, so I'm going to quote him. One pervasive feature of the book is the way the carefully modulated sentences of Williams the analytic philosopher seem to resist the heroic and romantic project he takes over from Nietzsche. The Nietzschean Williams resists the smugness and trivializing fastidiousness of most philosophical analysis, while the analytic Williams keeps any inclinations to wretched excess of the Nietzschean sort well under control. Comfortable professors in comfortable liberal democracies have good prudential reasons to be wary of wretched excess. Unless, of course, it has no consequences for our actual lives, as with, say, Derrida or Zizek or other excrescences of academic life. Certainly, Williams avoids Nietzsche's perhaps more consequential excesses. But let us not forget William Blake's quip more than 300 years ago that the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. On the chance that Blake is right, we might do well then to keep both Williams and the very different Nietzsche both in view. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Well, we've got 44 minutes for questions, which is quite a long time. I'm going to abuse Chairwoman's privilege by kicking off with a question about how to read Homer. In the ancient world, people like Thrasymachus and Callicles and Polus wanted to represent the Homeric past as one in which something like an ethics of might and power and dominance of other people was the right way to read Homer and the Greek tradition at large behind them. Yeah. Other people found something different in Homer. They found a sense of the tragedy of life, of the vulnerability of people before irresistible forces that overpower them, before violence that destroys everything in its path, and saw this as tragic. And so the simple way to put my question is just to say, what do you make of Simone Weil's reading of Homer in the Iliad as poem of force?
Yeah. So, I mean, Simone Weil is a good example, but I think there are many others. I think it's basically a Christian reinterpretation of Homer. And I think the first reading, it's a little more nuanced than that, but I think the first reading is probably closer to the mark of what the Homeric epics are actually about in terms of their ethos. And that is certainly how Nietzsche read them. Now, I want to add something, which is Nietzsche's own values are not simply the Homeric values, right? But as between the ethics of the broadly speaking Homeric world that carries well forward, into later Greece and even Rome, right? Nietzsche's on that side as against the Christian alternative. So,
Okay, thank you. We'll continue this later. Who's next? I'll come round with the microphone, and I'll try and be fair. And if we can all keep our interventions short, there'll be more of them.
Brian, thanks. I found that interesting. There are a lot of bits and pieces of it and a lot of parts. And so I kind of want to focus on some and specific aspects of it.
yeah.
The part I'm particularly interested in is the part you really started off with, that Williams, as it were, is really, despite his presentation as following Nietzsche, is really targeting, as it were, morality and moral theory rather than morality in the broader sense of moral life out there in neoliberal modern society. I'm sort of inclined to say is about some of the other aspects that what you say sounds plausible, and it might be, I think, and a lot of other people might have things to say about this as well, that I can imagine William saying, yes, of course, there are lots of aspects of Nietzsche that he repudiates and is quite happy to say he's at a distance from, and including what he might regard as some of the excesses about the elitism and so on and so forth. Right. But just bracketing that aside, to come back to this first point you made, I wonder how much you think that you can insulate moral theory from moral life in the way that your analysis suggests. And I say this in defense of Williams, and I'll give you a particular account of one particular aspect of it is the whole notion of what he refers to as the notional republic. And this self-image that we have that is theoretical in that, but it involves this ambition, a theoretical ambition to deepen the voluntary, as he puts it in Shame and Necessity. But that really does bleed out. You can't just contain that into theory because there's a kind of reciprocal relationship between philosophers theorizing and actual concrete moral life. And that in something like, as you mentioned, I think it was an interesting point, neoliberal society, that self-image cuts quite deep. And part of the effort is to actually articulate what a lot of people have of that self-image, which is that we're not just lucky, we are these radical self-controllers, and that's very important to legitimizing a lot of what goes on in modernity and modern life, particularly in neoliberal capitalist moral life, that both in a retributive and distributive sense is very important to trying to make that legitimate.
Okay. Don't take the microphone away from him because I may need to ask him a question. So I think the crucial claim you made there, which I'm not sure is true, is that philosophical theorizing has a reciprocal relationship with actual life. I think in the Thompson conception, right, there's definitely a relationship in that the philosophers think of themselves as trying to vindicate what they take to be ordinary concepts, right? And you certainly see that in the context of discussions of praise and blame and, and freedom and responsibility. I think it is there. I'm a little more skeptical about the reciprocal, that is the extent to which it goes the other way, right? So look, take voluntary action and responsibility. So we have, we without a doubt have a legal system that apportions responsibility, assigns blame, and then justifies punishment or sanctions or fines, depending on whether it's a criminal or civil context, on that basis. Okay, and then a lot of philosophers spend a lot of time trying to, as it were, make sense of that, right, to vindicate it. Now, I think someone like, just talk about contemporaries, I think someone like Dirk Pierboom actually comes closer to the mark because I think his view is not that unlike Nietzsche's view about this, and he correctly sees that the existing practices of blame and responsibility in the criminal law can't in fact survive a radical skepticism about freedom and responsibility. And then he tries to, as it were, propose some alternatives. Now, I don't think I think there's a way in which Nietzsche would be somewhat sympathetic. I don't want to particularly endorse his responses as policy proposals, right? So, Peerboom has this notion that since no one basically deserves blame for anything that they do, that we can only really justify punishment, for example, the way we justify quarantines, right? So someone with an infectious disease, you may quarantine them, okay, but you wouldn't blame them, right? You wouldn't jail them, because they got this particular disease. I think that would be a disastrous policy proposal, but it doesn't change the fact that I think I agree with him, and Nietzsche would agree, that the practices themselves don't admit of any kind of philosophical or theoretical vindication. However, as I think often happens, there are lots of reasons in practical and political life to have certain practices, even though they lack that kind of foundation. And I think that is the case with free will and responsibility. As some of you know, Gideon Yaffe was recently circulating a philosopher's brief in this case about the insanity defense and responsibility that the Supreme Court is going to hear. And I commend him for doing that. I guarantee they will pay no attention to it. Guarantee. And that's a worry about the reciprocal part, about whether it's really going to be going the other way, or whether it's really a one-way street of philosophers in the Thompson mode observing certain cultural practices and then trying to, come up with some more systematic account that vindicates them. And as I say, that's the thing that is really so foreign to most of the continental tradition, that what you would want to do in philosophy is vindicate ordinary ways of thinking and talking about things.
Okay, I see three people who want to speak at this point. Does any of them want to make the contentious claim that they have a finger? Or are they all hands? They're all hands.
I've got 10.
I've never believed claims about whether people have hands.
Thanks for the stimulating talk. When Williams writes that the morality system is the outlook, or incoherently part of the outlook of almost all of us, I think he's trying to underline the point that the morality system isn't just a product or an accretion due to bad philosophy. Rather, both the bad philosophy and the distortion in our moral ideas outside the seminar room are both traced back to certain, as he puts it, forces worth worrying about. And I think those forces will take us back to Nietzsche in an interesting way. So, for instance, psychological forces such as ressentiment, or the mother and father that you mentioned, power, and this sense of freedom. These are at the root of the distortions both in the philosophy and the everyday moral consciousness. And don't you think that if we were to look for that in Williams, for the psychological needs and desires that shape our ideas even outside the seminar room, we would get him much closer to Nietzsche?
Okay, good. Thanks. Okay, a couple things. So remember, the feature of the morality system that he lays the most emphasis on is this very demanding notion of obligation. And I don't think that exists in the real world. And I think it exists seems to exist in certain philosophers' conceptions of morality, though arguably not even in Kant's, as Steve Darwell will argue. But I don't think it exists in the real world. And if you think it exists, then the question is, where do you think it exists? Where's the evidence of it? And one doesn't really see that, certainly the evidence in the way anyone lives, or indeed, more importantly, in the way they assess what other people do. Ordinary morality is, I think, a good deal more forgiving, right? And I don't think it's just a matter of its incoherentness. I think deep down, if you tried to press on ordinary people what this demanding notion of obligation requires, it would actually make no sense to them. Now, you can say, well, this is an empirical claim. Well, I have some anecdotal empirical evidence from trying to explain these things to ordinary people, and they often find it very puzzling. But I think there's a more important point you're making that I think I also want to disagree with, which is whether it's really the case that the psychological roots of the peculiarity of philosophical systems and their distant relatives in ordinary morality actually have the same psychological sources. Okay? I don't actually think Nietzsche believes that. Okay? I think it's very important for Nietzsche that in saying that the slave revolt in morality was produced by ressentiment, this kind of funny psychological state that mixes both envy and at the same time, anger and a desire for vengeance, right? So the slaves envy the position of the masters, but at the same time, the masters make their lives miserable, so they would love to kill them, but they can't actually kill them. So all they're going to have is an imaginary revenge, namely inverting their value structure. Right? That's a claim about the origins, right? One of the several different origins of the morality we've inherited. It's not a claim about our motivations. And Nietzsche's, and in a way I think you agree with this based on the other article of yours that I'm somewhat familiar with. Right? It's not Nietzsche's claim that everybody who accepts Christian morality now is motivated by ressentiment. Nor is it a claim that everybody who believes in free will now is motivated by this same sense of, pride, wanting to feel responsible for what you're doing. And that's just one of his many hypotheses. I mean, he says that free will has its origin in this desire to want to punish people and so on, okay? And maybe that one plays a little more role still to this day. But I think ressentiment is not a good candidate. And then the flip side of that is I don't think Nietzsche thinks that you explain the peculiarities of philosophical systems by reference to the operation of these psychological motivations. Okay? So what's his view about Kant, right? I mean, his view about Kant, his view about great philosophers generally, is that their philosophical systems are meant to vindicate their moral commitments, right? And Kant actually has the virtue of being one of the few great philosophers to sort of admit this when he says the whole point of putting limits on reason is to make room for faith, right? And that's, kind of what Nietzsche is claiming is going on quite generally. And this is why Nietzsche never engages in any systematic way with the metaphysics and epistemology. It's obviously, by his lights, just an elaborate post hoc rationalization to ultimately get the morality out of things. And the morality that Kant gets out is just a systematization of the current moral consensus. That's how Nietzsche looks at it. So I don't think he thinks those psychological motivations that may play a role in the origin of morality actually play a role either in current moral attitudes or in what the philosophers are doing. So I would resist on both counts the suggestion.
Okay, there exist some things such that they are fingers. There's one from Stephen Darwell and one from Bodek.
Well, just a couple of thoughts. One is that about what you were calling the demanding notion of moral obligation. That I think it's ambiguous, and it's important to disambiguate it. You might think that the concept of moral obligation is itself demanding in the sense that it purports to have what Williams calls deliberative priority. That is, there can never be sufficient reason to violate your all things considered moral obligation. That's a very different view from the view that moral considerations always outweigh other reasons. It also puts a real weight on, well, so really what are we morally obligated, all things considered, to do? And there, as I'll suggest tomorrow, I think Williams way overreaches in the argument there. I appreciate the way you were just describing the Nietzschean dynamic of how ressentiment works, and that all seemed exactly right to me, with one possible wrinkle, which is it seems as if what's going on is not just a reversal of values, because that would be consistent with just thinking, well, the things that were bad are good, and the things that are bad are good or bad. There's this new concept of evil, and evil is not simply bad. It's this thing you have this distinctive responsibility for. So that it's the concept of evil that brings into play the concerns about freedom of the will and so on. So I just was wondering whether you agreed with that.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
I was simplifying for purposes, right. It is more than a simple reversal, though there is the inversion. Michael Foster has a very nice paper sort of tracking the way the New Testament inverts every value you find in the Homeric ethics. And it is very striking when you sort of line up the passages. But clearly there is more to it. And part of the difference between a good and bad morality versus a good and evil morality, I mean, there are several. One is that for the slave morality, evil is the primary concept, good is the afterthought. Right? Good is defined by contrast. We start with the fact that what these people are doing to us, they're evil, and we add a metaphysics of agency, namely they are responsible for what they do for us and blameworthy for doing what they're doing to us, and they ought to stop doing it, right? Because
It wouldn't be evil unless they were. That's the crucial point. In other words, it's part of the concept of evil that builds blameworthiness into it.
yes, I agree with that as well. I think that is how Nietzsche thinks of it. So yes.
And also that the goodness is different. So it's not the same old goodness. It's moral goodness. It's goodness. It's by contrast.
It is goodness, right? It's moral goodness in the sense that the weak and the slaves are praiseworthy for not doing the things they can't actually do,
Yeah,
right?
an exercise of will and responsibility.
That's correct.
Which is quite
And you see this very clearly in section 13 of the first essay of the genealogy. It was a famous passage on lambs and the birds of prey. So yes, I agree with all of this.
So it was very interesting, but I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable about Nietzsche, so I'd like to ask you kind of question to clarify this. This idea of identifying the ancient Greeks' position with Homeric ethics, but how did Nietzsche found place for pre-Christian philosophers, in particular Plato and Aristotle? How did they see them? This kind of their philosophical psychology was so different from the one that he described. Right?
Yeah. So in Nietzsche's way of telling it, the great philosophers of Greece are the Greeks of the 5th century, before Socrates. And with Socrates, the rot sets in.
Okay.
About Plato, he says, Nietzsche famously says that really great philosophers are legislators of value. And in that regard, he doesn't think Kant is a great philosopher because he thinks Kant is a mere systematizer of current, moral prejudices. This is the historicist, Nietzsche, talking. But I think the one he thinks is a really great philosopher is Plato. And part of the significance of Plato is that, as he also says, Christianity is Platonism for the people. And this is why it becomes so, culturally important and significant. So Socrates, Plato, he has less to say about Aristotle, but we could put him in. He has a bit more to say about the Stoics. They represent kind of this elaborate philosophical reaction to the prior Greek world, right? And then through the force of Christianity, it becomes our world.
So it's prefiguration of Christianity.
Yes.
I can't resist commenting on my way to the next question, but it seems a bit harsh to say of Kant that he doesn't believe that it's all about legislating and making a law.
But it's not creating values, right? That is, even Kant says, right, he's just systematizing what every German peasant knows, right? And as Nietzsche famously says, and he does so in language the German peasant can never understand.
Thanks. Thanks, Brian. I'm slightly nervous because I want to ask you about the book you deliberately didn't talk about, namely Truth and Truthfulness. But I'm just quite fascinated by the passing remarks you made about that book. And I asked that question in relation to my... So I'm just not really convinced by this claim that Williams in Shame and Necessity isn't historicist in a way Nietzsche is. So and these two aspects are connected. So it's true that Williams wants to emphasize unacknowledged or implicit commonalities, similarities between the Greeks and us. But that's surely compatible with the historicist idea. So one way to cash it out is, well, we inherited a set of concepts from the Greeks, but we understand them in a very different way, or the significance of these concepts are very different, or even, another interpretation is, well, we have a very different array of concepts from the one that Greeks had.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't be able to understand what the concepts we operated with unless we look at how they came about from the earlier ones. So on the face of it, just emphasizing the similarities doesn't make him an anti-historicist.
But you don't think Williams is advocating the second way of thinking about it, do you? You're not claiming that.
I don't know which of the
I don't think he
ways
is.
of cashing out is, more accurate, or and this is of course beside the question of whether the moral psychology that Williams attributes to the Greeks is similar to the one Nietzsche thinks they had. So that's a different question, right?
Yeah.
And I think Truth and Truthlessness is the work in which Williams exhibits or displays the kind of thought that sort of reinforces this sort of historicist attention.
Yeah.
And I was wondering why, I wanted you to say more about why you thought, it's not really a sort of Nietzschean work. I mean, you said, I think, Williams's genealogy is just so story, whereas Nietzsche has a sort of historical, philological sort of accuracy. Well, that's not quite true. I think Williams thinks that the state of nature story, or what the original functions of certain concepts are, story about that can be sort of have a sort of imaginative content. But he thinks that how those concepts with an original function develop or undergo various transformation, that is something that you need a real historical sense to investigate. And so I think that's something Williams shares with Nietzsche. The other point you made was that right. So for Nietzsche, genealogy is critical. For Williams, genealogy in that book is vindicatory. But vindicatory genealogy and critical genealogy aren't incompatible choices. If anything, it's doing vindicatory genealogy by means of critical genealogy. So I didn't think either of these points, as it were, disqualifies the kind of enterprise that Williams is engaged in that book from being Nietzschean.
Let me just ask you a question about the very last thing you said. How are you understanding the word critical here? Right. So on the genealogy of morality, I mean, it's subtitled a polemic, right? And he tells us in the preface that what he's really interested in, right, is a revaluation of values, is changing the way that we look at, say, the value of selflessness and altruism. And the goal of the book is to shake people's confidence in this morality that we have inherited from these various historical sources. So he's very explicit. The whole point is to undermine morality, right? That's not Williams's purpose On Truth and Truthfulness. Now, I admit I didn't reread that for purposes of this conference because I was focused on shame and necessity and ethics and the limits of philosophy. So maybe I'm misremembering something very, very important. But the point of the book was to actually vindicate this interest that we have in truth and truthfulness, not to undermine it. And then just on the substance, right, there is something else that I didn't mention that is kind of strangely un-Nietzschean about this, which is that it's one of Nietzsche's standing themes, right, that the great mistake of the Platonic Christian world that we have inherited to the present, and that is present in the natural scientific outlook, is that we overvalue truth. We completely overvalue how important it is to know the truth, when in fact Nietzsche thinks that the actual truth about things is really quite terrible. and that illusion is actually an indispensable condition of human life, right? So even that part of it is, in a way, sort of odd. Nietzsche, if he's looking at this book, he's saying, what a funny thing to write about. But really, I don't understand how you can be both critical and vindicatory in the sense that I'm understanding those terms. So maybe you meant something else by saying they were compatible?
Well, no, I didn't have anything particular in mind when I said critical, because critical was the word you used in passing.
Right. But I mean, and it's critical in this very precise sense that the genealogy is meant to attack and displace a certain kind of morality, not to vindicate it at all.
Yeah, and I think even in that sense, it's not incompatible with vindicatory ambition. But I think I mean, it's certainly not incompatible with ambition to vindicate something other than the pre-reflective understanding.
Well, that could be true, right? But genealogy itself doesn't play that particular role for Nietzsche. That's what I meant by that. On the historical evidence point, I mean, even the concession that the story about origins, right, can be a just so story, right, is quite foreign to the way Nietzsche thinks about genealogy. I mean, Nietzsche uses the German word genealogy interchangeably with Geschichte. He thinks that genealogy just is history, right? And, it's kind of taken on a sort of, special term of art status. But he thinks it's really good history that corrects mistakes that other historians of morality have made, and it is supposed to be based on documentary evidence. He essentially says that. And his main preferred form of documentary evidence is etymological evidence, right, about the way that certain terms were used, right, that tells us something about the very different original sense that they had, right, compared to the sense they have since acquired. On your point about historicism, it is of course correct that the mere pointing to similarities in concepts doesn't show that one isn't an historicist, right? It's an open historical question whether or not the terms have the same meaning, the same referent in different historical epochs. So that's fair enough. But I do think, right, that Williams is on the anti-historicist side with his efforts to try to show that those concepts that the Greeks had are really a lot like our concepts. And now this does get into some of the details of the claims, right? I mean, so in the case of shame and his attempt to show that that it plays a lot of the role that guilt plays for us, I'm not sure that I find that very plausible. I think I'm more persuaded by the Atkins line on this. I think shame has a very strong egoistic component to it. I think the Ajax example, in a funny way, is a little misleading, right? Because the internalized gaze, if we want to call it that Ajax takes on board, is that of his father, full stop, right? That's what really counts for him, right? That it would be utterly shameful, right? To appear before his father having been unable to perform, right? And to continue living. So I think there are aspects of the whole philosophical psychology where he's overreaching a bit for the continuities. And then when he notes the obvious differences, like they don't have the notion of will, they don't actually have the word for intention, and then he has to make quite a lot of effort to say that none of that really matters. All of that betrays to me a kind of strong anti-historicist impulse here. Whether it's mistaken is then going to turn on the details of the interpretation of the Greeks that beyond my expressing my sympathies, I'm not competent really to argue against what he says in detail.
Yeah,
So.
thanks.
Okay, I'm aware that we have 3 in the queue, here, and here. If there's anyone else who wants to participate in the discussion, please make yourself known to me, because interchanges are taking quite a long time at the moment, which is fine because we still have a quarter of an hour. We'll need to get a little brisker. Lots of people put their hands up at this point.
I'll try to get brisker.
Thank you. So if I could give a quick comment on this exchange and then I'll ask my question. So thanks. Yes, about genealogy. I mean, one might say that the difference between vindicatory and critical debunking genealogy isn't so great. It's the same method after all, and so there's room. But actually, Williams is further from Nietzsche than that, because he's doing a particularly strange kind of genealogy, not only vindicatory, but one that posits origins. So he's actually combined the state of nature style of philosophical explanation that he draws from Craig with vindicatory, but otherwise Nietzsche methodological style genealogy. So I just put that in the mix, that I think I don't feel he's doing a radically different thing in doing something that isn't debunking, but he's doing a more obviously different thing from Nietzsche when we look at the fact that he posits origins. And it's all, I think he is highly historicist, because of course the reason to posit state of nature is to see whether there's anything that looks like it's practically necessary vis-a-vis our practices of truth-telling. And then he discovers, he takes himself to discover, the proto-virtues of accuracy and sincerity, but they're not yet virtues. All the rest is going to be history. And so we'll see that in different cultures at different times, these proto-virtues of accuracy plus sincerity get played out in very different ways. So, I don't know, see, both posits necessity and history. There's my comment on that. But I wondered whether you had any sympathy with the idea that what Williams takes from Nietzsche above all is the critical program within morality, because there are, it always seems to me, I quite take the point that he's not sort of, as it were, going in for any totalizing smashing or anything, but rather he is at his most Nietzschean when he's calling out bluff, when he's seeing through the positing of objectivity that isn't really there, seeing through the positing of external reasons which are really internal. Is that not Nietzschean? So that's my sort of first half of this real question. And the second half is just one of the places where he really does look Nietzschean is in that paper, Nietzsche's Minimalist Moral Psychology. And he sort of, I forget all the details, but the key Nietzschean point he really wants to lift from Nietzsche is, I think Nietzsche's right about this, that the trouble with morality system style thinking is it leads you to believe in this thing called the will that's different from the agent, but somehow embedded in the agent. So we end up with a weird kind of double counting of action. So here I am, autonomously beginning a causal chain. I cause my will to do something in the world. So that's two actions, not one. And he takes himself as taking that directly from Nietzsche. So I just wondered what you thought about those two, to my mind, more clearly Nietzschean influences or direct borrowings.
Okay, good. Thank you. May I ask you, though, just one question about what you said about on truth and truthfulness. You said Williams posits origins, right? Maybe posit is doing the work here, because they're make-believe origins. Nietzsche is interested in origins. He says morality has three or more origins. There's, in one of his letters, he says there could have been more than 3 essays in the genealogy. So Nietzsche is also interested in origins, but he claims to be discovering them, not positing them. Is that what you were getting at?
Well, I'm not sure. I think it's more than a posit in Williams' case, because I think he does think that if we go in for a disciplined piece of state of nature construction, where the discipline consists in being very careful to only talk about really basic and universal human needs, the needs to be able to pool information, then we'll automatically find that we'll have these proto-virtues of accuracy and sincerity generated. And I think he would think it follows from that posit that it's real. It's really going to be a feature of any recognizably human society, that they'll have some version of those proto-virtues. But of course, if it's in real history, they will be a very distinctive, historicized version of that virtue.
So it's an argument about what the real origin must be, given what is going to be necessary for a society to be a society at all. That it has to have standards of accuracy and sincerity, so that must have been the case.
I'm not even sure about that. So that must have been the case. I think the claim is any society is going to have some version of accuracy plus sincerity. Otherwise, it's going to be so radically dysfunctional vis-a-vis basic needs to be able to pool information.
Okay. Yeah. Again, I mean, that's helpful. And again, I'm handicapped here by it being a number of years since I actually read that book. I still think there's a very striking difference with Nietzsche here, right? Which is that he doesn't argue in that form about what the origins must have been like. He argues on the basis of evidence he thinks he can adduce, right? That's clearest in the first essay. It gets more complicated in the second and third essay. So in that regard, the approach just seems to be very different in terms of how we're to what counts as evidence in favor of the claim about the origin. Okay, on the other two points. I think it is obviously true that if you want to call morality's bluff, as you nicely put it, that this has kind of Nietzschean overtones. And I think a lot of it then depends on the details of what bluff you're calling and how you're calling it, right? And so I think that arguably reflects, again, that he read Nietzsche, and this was partly why he was more sympathetic to Nietzsche, say, than someone like Derek Parfit. And it's precisely because he didn't object to, being highly skeptical about morality's pretensions in various ways. So that's fair enough. I agree with that. Again, I think you're going to find on a lot of the details and, as it were, the extremity of it, that there are that there are striking differences. And you see that again with, Williams's whole emphasis on, maintaining an idea of the voluntary and responsibility and so on, which Nietzsche doesn't, right? As I say, to put it in a contemporary context, his ultimate views are a bit closer to something like the Peerboom view, which is highly revisionary of a lot of ordinary practice. Now, you're right about Nietzsche's minimalist moral psychology. I should add something. I decided to take books as my target. I think it is correct that what he says in that paper about the double counting, of the will and the action, he's clearly taking directly from section 13 of the first essay On the Genealogy of Morality, and is endorsing that kind of view. The thing that I think is a little misleading about that paper is that the moral psychology is much less minimal than that. And that's the burden of the book I just published, right? That it's actually, it's quite a maximal moral psychology that happens to jibe well with a lot of the cognitive science of the last 50 years. Not that Nietzsche did cognitive science, but he was a very good speculative moral psychologist, as it were. But I'm glad you brought that up, and I will add something in the final version of this paper that deals with that paper in particular. So thanks for those.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes and still 3 questions to fit in.
So, thank you very much. I'm very ignorant on the matter, so it's more of a clarificatory question.
Sure.
I found it really, really interesting when you were saying that, if I understood it correctly, Nietzsche's rejection of the idea that the will causally connects with our action rejects the dichotomy between compatibilism and incompatibilism altogether. And then I was struck because then you said that I may identify with my will, but I cannot be responsible for it. And I was just wondering, since even this morning with Miranda's talk, there was a tension between Williams, for example, talking about deliberation and discovery.
Yeah.
I thought, what if we put forth a different version of compatibilism, and we say that if we identify with our wills, and if the will is what causally causes our actions, then in a sense, I don't know, maybe we can say that we're free insofar as there's that identification, even though, and this wouldn't reject the dichotomy altogether. And then I was thinking, well, then what can reject the dichotomy between compatibilism and incompatibilism? And
Good.
Yeah.
So I can clarify. The full answer would go on so long that Sophie Grace would hit me on the head with the microphone. So, but I can clarify a little bit, right? I wasn't saying that, I wasn't purporting to reject the difference between compatibilism and incompatibilism. What I was saying is that Nietzsche clearly rejects incompatibilist views of free will, and he gives reasons why you would have to reject various compatibilist candidates too. The reasons are different in different cases, and I really did gloss over them somewhat superficial. Well, not somewhat. I reviewed them very superficially here. This I know is going to just sound like shameless plugging of my book. Chapter 5 of the book is all about going through various candidate explanations and showing why Nietzsche's basic picture, in which conscious, practical deliberation, contrary to what the truth that Williams thinks is obvious, is not in fact causal and explanatory of the things that we do. But that's the details of the argument I'm going to have to disappoint you in not setting out now, because it would take a long time. Though maybe we can talk about it during the breaks and stuff. Thank you.
I was really thinking of time. Maybe we have it. Let's see. Thank you for a very interesting list of differences, first off. I was just thinking we might want to ask ourselves how much of that list is due to genuine differences of opinion, and how much is due to a need for certain translations to be made in order to make people listen. You see what I mean?
Well, let me try to restate what I think you might mean, then you tell me whether this is right.
Right.
So, so Williams is simply stating in a form that would be intelligible to us the things that Nietzsche was getting at, and so it's not really a difference of opinion between them. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Williams is a more polite form of Nietzsche?
I suppose, or
Okay.
a one more adapted to the analytic mainstream, say.
Okay. So I think it is certainly true that, as that reviewer I quoted at the end said, right, that that he clearly is working loosely within analytic moral philosophy. But again, I think there are more to the differences than that, right? Now, I do think that because of, as it were, the professional norms of analytic moral philosophy, it's part of the reason that you get such a watered down version of some Nietzschean ideas, in fact, watered down to the point that they wouldn't be recognizable to Nietzsche, with some exceptions, right, including the one that Miranda just brought up. So there are some points of continuity, but I do think it's more dramatic than just a translation issue. I mean, that's the burden of what I'm trying to argue here.
Since we've got to the last question that I'm aware of, let me say that no one will die if we overrun a little. You'll just have to drink your coffee faster.
Thank you. So as someone who tends to, maybe emphasize the similarities between Nietzsche and Williams, I very much appreciated you emphasizing the differences. And I think you're certainly right that Williams is in many sense much more a common sense philosopher. I guess I would say that this derives from him being a more piecemeal philosopher. So the common-sensic or the conservative aspect comes from him being a more piecemeal thinker, I guess. In terms of the historicism, anti-historicism, I'm not sure the binary contrast works so well here. I mean, as has been emphasized before, I mean, I would certainly agree that Williams is probably less historicist about responsibility. But, I mean, infamously, he thinks that the history of some concepts is more interesting than the history of other concepts.
Yeah.
So I think it's a bit more problematic here. He's certainly less historicist about responsibility, but, for example, actually maybe more historicist about standards of human excellence than Nietzsche is. And it comes back to the whole him being more piecemeal.
Yeah.
But, so the question I would like to ask you is that, so actually, they do strike me as very similar, and I do think that maybe the difference can be explained as a difference in, sensibility or temperament, how to talk about certain cases. And you mentioned some examples, for example, the idea of, so I do agree that it's a challenge for Williams to argue that the peculiar institution actually exists. And you mentioned that, people don't tend to think that there are such things as obligations in this demanding sense. They don't exist. But, I guess the question is, does that mean that they do believe there are obligations, but not in that demanding sense? Or do they not think that there are obligations? So is it more of a nihilist sense? Okay, it's
it's the first. Yeah, no, I think people use the language of obligation, but I think it's very clear from ordinary moral life, which I take to be hugely influenced by the structure of the capitalist world, that they don't have anything like this very demanding notion in either of the two senses. I think that Steve distinguished, right? Either the deliberative priority or the overridingness sense. So that was the claim that I was making. I think they have much watered down notions. I think the exceptions you do find among Orthodox religious groups, that they treat their obligations that way, though not exactly for Kant's reasons, shall we say, but because the wrath of God is serious business. Depends on the religious tradition.
I see.
So.
Because I guess one way of getting Williams out of this bind would be to say that, well, to essentially say that there's a certain counterfactual moralism going on, in the sense that if there were obligations, they would have to be like this and extremely demanding. But of course, there are no obligations. There are no things like this, so there are no obligations.
And is that your claim about what Williams is saying? Because it doesn't sound to me like that's Williams's position.
No, I'm saying that, so if you point to actually how people tend to conceptualize their moral life and then say, well, essentially my claim is in Nietzsche in terms, I guess my claim is also saying that the neoliberal people you pointed to are in fact, in a certain sense, I guess, nihilists about obligation, and not necessarily that don't have this less demanding conception of obligation, but they actually do have this very demanding conception. But because they do have this very commanding conception, they come to the conclusion that there are no obligations.
Okay.
And if we were to go down that route, I guess we could argue that they're closer to each other than you suggested.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I mean the problem then is that it would undermine that this is a claim about, you know, how morality naturally develops outside the philosopher's armchair, which does seem to be central to what Williams is claiming. Because now if we go this route, we admit, actually, no, it's only in the armchair. And they don't really have any notion of obligation. They use the word, but it's not the real thing. Something like that. And I don't think that would be congenial to Williams.
No, I guess what I was trying to argue is that they have this demanding sense of obligation, but just that sense of obligation doesn't find any expression in the world.
So in what sense are they nihilists then?
In the sense that, so for example, in the sense that they do have a sense of obligation, but that sense of obligation, obligations don't exist because they don't find any. So I do see a certain, well, difference in spirit between, shall we say, that more incompatibilist spirit that says, okay, that if there were to be obligations, they would be like this, but they don't actually exist. And the more, well, yeah, we may say pragmatist spirit that lowers the standard of what it would mean to actually have an obligation.
I see.
And I guess that's very much what Williams would like to have us do, is to say, yes, there are obligations, but they're nothing like this extremely demanding conception. And Nietzsche, I suggest, is more on the other end of the spectrum, emphasizing, yes, so obligations would need to be this demanding thing, but don't exist. Sorry.
Yeah, so I don't actually think that the second part is true about Nietzsche. Maybe on the first part, maybe that's... Let me meditate on it. Thank you.
And while he's meditating, let's all thank him for his talk.